My parents said we were broke. Then they spent $50,000 on my sister's second wedding. I'm 18, male, the kind of kid who learned early that "we don't have money for that" was a sentence with an asterisk. Skinny, quiet, the type who does his homework at the kitchen table because we never had a desk in my room. I got decent grades, stayed out of trouble, worked a part-time job at a hardware store since I was 16. I didn't ask for much. I learned not to. My sister is 11 years older than me. We're not close, not enemies, just strangers who share a last name and a childhood address. She left for college when I was 7, came back occasionally for holidays, and always seemed to exist in a slightly different tax bracket than the rest of us, even when she didn't. She married her first husband when I was 14. Big ceremony, destination venue, the whole production. My parents paid for most of it. I remember my dad sitting at the dining table afterward, rubbing his face, saying, "We'll be paying that off for 2 years." He was right. They were. The marriage lasted 3 years. Now she was getting remarried. Same energy, different groom. And apparently, the budget had no memory of the first time. Here's what my life looked like at 18. I've been accepted to a state university, not a dream school, but a solid program for civil engineering. I'd applied for financial aid, gotten a partial scholarship, and sat down with my parents in March to talk about the gap. About $14,000 a year that wasn't covered. Not a wild number. Not impossible. My dad made decent money at his union job. My mom worked part-time bookkeeping. We weren't rich, but $14,000 felt bridgeable. That conversation went like this. My dad leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and said, "We just don't have it right now. The timing's bad." My mom nodded along, looking somewhere slightly to the left of my face. "You should look into more loans. Work study. There are options." I said, "I have a partial scholarship. I'm working. I've already applied for every grant I qualified for. The gap is $14,000. We'll figure it out," my dad said, which I'd lived long enough to know meant "you'll figure it out." I left that conversation already mentally restructuring my plan. Maybe a community college first year to save money. Maybe delay a semester and work full-time. I was 18 and already doing the math on my own future like it was a logistics problem, because it was. 3 weeks later, my sister came home for dinner. She sat at the same table where I'd just been told there was no money, and she announced, with the energy of someone revealing a surprise vacation, that she and her new fiancé had set a date. Fall wedding. She wanted something more intimate this time. Intimate, she clarified, meant around 120 guests. My parents' faces did something I hadn't seen in that dining room in years. They lit up. My mom grabbed her hand across the table. My dad laughed, actually laughed, and said, "We'll make it work." I sat there with a fork in my hand and said nothing. I want to be precise about the timeline because it matters. The conversation where they told me there was no money for my tuition gap happened on a Saturday in late March. My sister's announcement dinner happened 18 days later. I know the gap because I had written the tuition conversation in my journal that night. Not out of sentimentality, but because I'd started keeping records of important conversations after a misunderstanding with my boss at the hardware store. 18 days. The planning started immediately. My mom pulled out a notebook. They talked venues before dessert was cleared. I did the dishes that night alone, listening to the 3 of them in the dining room, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to say anything yet. I was going to watch, document, and understand the full shape of what was happening before I responded to it. That patience was the most important decision I made. The wedding planning consumed our house the way a slow flood does, gradually, then completely. The dining table became a staging area for brochures and fabric swatches. My mom started getting calls from vendors during dinner. My dad, who had told me the timing was bad, started driving my sister to venues on weekends, burning his days off on tastings and walkthroughs. I kept working, kept saving, kept watching. The number I eventually landed on, $50,000, didn't come from a single source. It came from fragments. A catering invoice my mom left open on the kitchen counter. A venue deposit confirmation email I saw on the family printer, which sat in the hallway and had no privacy setting. A conversation about the florist that included a number that made me stop walking and stand very still in the hallway outside the kitchen. $50,000. Conservative estimate, probably low. Meanwhile, I had quietly enrolled at community college for the fall. I told my parents, and my dad nodded like it was a reasonable plan. My mom said, "That's smart, actually. Save some money." Neither of them connected the sentence to the one they'd said 18 days before her dinner announcement. Or they did connect it and chose not to acknowledge the geometry of it. My sister, though, she had opinions. She found out I was going to community college through my mom, and she called me directly. This was notable because she almost never called me directly. "You got into state," she said. "Why are you going to community?" "Money," I said. Brief pause. Mom and Dad can't help it all. They said the timing was bad. Another pause, longer this time. And then, carefully, "I'm sure they'll help when they can." I didn't say anything to that. I didn't need to. The silence did the work. She knew. I could tell by the way the conversation deflated, the way she moved on to asking about my courses with the slightly over-interested tone of someone changing a subject. She knew, and she wasn't going to say anything about it, and we both understood that about each other in that moment. The entitlement, when arrived in full, came from a direction I hadn't fully anticipated. My sister's fiancé, I'll just call him the fiancé, started coming around more. He was fine mostly, polite in that surface-level way that doesn't cost anything. But he had a specific relationship with my parents that bothered me. He treated them like a resource to be managed. Not mean about it, just efficient. He'd say things like, "We were thinking the rehearsal dinner could be here at the house, save the venue cost," and my parents would agree before fully processing what they'd agreed to. He once mentioned, in a group conversation at the kitchen table, that the honeymoon flights were expensive and that it would mean a lot if family could contribute. He said it looking at my dad. My dad said, "We'll see what we can do." I was sitting 3 feet away. A person who had been told there was no money for a $14,000 tuition gap. 3 feet away. I wrote the date in my journal that night and a single line underneath it. They will contribute to the honeymoon. They did. $800 cash in a card. I know because my mom mentioned it to her sister on a phone call I heard while making a sandwich. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't building towards something. I was. I had been quietly and carefully for 4 months. I wasn't angry in a way that made me reckless. I was angry in the way that makes you very, very organized. The moment that pushed me from watching to acting came from my sister herself, and it was almost accidental. We were in the kitchen alone, rare, and she was looking at something on her phone, and she said, without looking up, "You know, community college is actually a great foundation. Lots of successful people started there." She meant it as comfort. I know she did. But what I heard was, "This is the version of your future we've all accepted." What I heard was the quiet, frictionless assumption that I had adjusted, and we could all move on now. "I got an estate," I said. "I know," she said, still looking at her phone. "And there was money," I said, "just not for me." She looked up then, and I held her eyes for a long moment. not with anger, just with clarity. Then I walked out of the kitchen, went to my room, and opened my laptop. It was time. I want to be clear about what I did and what I didn't do. I didn't blow up at the dinner table. I didn't send a rage text at midnight. I didn't post anything online or try to publicly humiliate anyone. What I did was methodical, documented, and completely within my rights as an 18-year-old with a paper trail and a very clear understanding of how FAFSA works. First, financial aid. Most people my age don't know this, and I didn't either until I spent 3 evenings reading through federal student aid documentation. At 18, if you're listed as a dependent on your parents' taxes, their income and assets count toward your expected family contribution on the FAFSA. This is why my aid gap existed. My parents' income, on paper, looked like they could contribute. The government assumed they would. They didn't. What I also learned, there's a process called the dependency override. It's not easy to get, and it's not automatic, but it exists for situations where a dependent student can document that their parents are unwilling, not unable, unwilling to contribute to their education. It requires a written statement, supporting documentation, and review by the financial aid office. I had 4 months of documentation. I had the journal dates. I had a printed screenshot of the venue deposit confirmation. I had records of my own earnings and savings. I had the community college enrollment as evidence that I had already restructured my life around their refusal. I made an appointment with the financial aid office at my state university, the school I'd actually gotten into, and I brought a folder. The conversation took 40 minutes. The financial aid counselor, to her credit, was thorough and direct. She explained the process clearly. The override wasn't guaranteed. The committee would review. It would take 4 to 6 weeks, and I'd need a formal letter detailing the situation. She also said, and this part one won't be precise about, that documented evidence of parental financial capacity being directed elsewhere, while a student is denied support, strengthens an override application significantly. I wrote the letter that night. 3 pages. No dramatics. Just chronology. March conversation, 18 days, the announcement dinner, the catering invoice amount, the venue deposit, the honeymoon contribution. Dates, amounts, observable facts. I submitted it with the folder of documentation. Then I waited. My parents didn't know any of this was happening. Neither did my sister. I was still living at home, still working my hardware store shifts, still showing up to dinner and doing dishes. On the outside, I had accepted the situation. On the inside, I was waiting for a letter from a financial aid committee. For weeks in, my sister's bridal shower happened at our house. I helped move furniture. I carried folding tables from the garage. I smiled at her friends when they arrived and then went to my room and studied. The entitlement, in its final and most concentrated form, arrived 2 days after the bridal shower. My sister sat my parents down. I was in my room, door open, the house carries sound, and she told them that the final catering invoice had come in higher than expected. She needed an additional $4,000. And then she said something that I've thought about many times since. I know you've given a lot, but this is a once-in-a-lifetime thing. Her second wedding. Once in a lifetime. My dad said, "We'll figure it out." The same 4 words he'd used with me. But this time, he meant it differently. I closed my bedroom door quietly and waited. The financial aid committee letter arrived 11 days later. The letter approved the dependency override. I read it 3 times standing at the mailbox. My hands weren't shaking. I was past the emotional part of this. I was in the operational part. The override meant I was now classified as an independent student for federal financial aid purposes. My parents' income no longer counted. My own income and assets Modest, 18-year-old Modest, formed the entire basis of my EFC. The recalculated aid package covered the gap. I was in a state university in the fall, fully funded between grants, loans in my name only, my own scholarship, and my savings. My parents would contribute $0, which matched exactly what they had been willing to contribute. I enrolled the same afternoon. I told my parents at dinner that evening. I didn't build to it. I just said it plainly. I'm going to state in the fall. I got an independent student classification through the financial aid office. It covers everything. My mom looked confused. What does that mean, independent classification? It means my aid is based on my finances, not yours. My dad put his fork down. How did you get that? I applied for it, documented the situation. The committee approved it. The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when adults realize a situation they thought they controlled had been resolved without them. My dad's expression moved through several phases. My mom looked at her plate. My sister, who was there for dinner, of course she was there constantly now, looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. It wasn't quite guilt. It was more like recalibration. That's good, she said finally. That's really good. I know, I said, and went back to eating. The harder conversation came later that week when my dad knocked on my bedroom door. He sat on the edge of my desk chair, which nobody ever used, and he said, I didn't know you were struggling with this. I looked at him. I told you in March. I didn't know how serious it was. I told you the number. 14,000. I told you it was the gap. He was quiet for a moment. Then, we should have handled that better. It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement I was going to get, and I knew it. I didn't push for more. I said, yeah, and let it sit. The wedding happened in October. I went. I wore the suit I'd bought myself with hardware store money. I watched my parents give a toast with the specific warmth they reserved for my sister, and I sat at the table and ate the catering food that had cost $4,000 more than budgeted and thought about nothing in particular. What I know now, a few months removed, is that nobody in my family is a villain in the movie version sense. They're just people who made choices and assumed I would absorb the consequences. What they didn't account for was that I was paying attention, that I was documenting, and that I was 18 years old with enough patience to let the system work in my favor instead of flipping a table. I started state in January, deferred one semester to line up housing, which I'm also handling myself. Engineering program, full schedule, zero family contribution. The $50,000 wedding is somebody else's memory. My degree is going to be mine. If you read all 4 parts, you basically have the patience for a civil engineering degree yourself. So you might as well subscribe and see how the rest of this builds out.